So when we're talking about the American Empire, everything goes back to FDR. Much like the French, we have a sequence of technically contiguous republics, but really it is a new, completely new empire. Obviously, you have the founders. It is remade with Andrew Jackson, remade during the Civil War, and then very much so remade through FDR. As I'm sure you know, he made a number of sweeping economic changes. He brought in our sort of pension pyramid scheme that's still a millstone around our neck. But also, he is what launched the American empire from a regional to a international superpower. Right before then, we still had colonies, but they were, tiny little islands no one cared about. We were still invading foreign nations, but they were mostly within our hemisphere, right? North and Central American countries. And so that's really what launched America as an empire we know it today. And so because of that, the Republican Party, the conservative movement writ large, its first real identity, because before FDR, there really were no conservatives in America. It was what flavor of progressive were you? And so the original conservatives, so to speak, existed in opposition to FDR. You have figures like Garrett, kind of what we call now the old right, who existed in opposition to FDR's sweeping changes. Just for example, FDR made owning gold illegal. He stole all of the gold in America. Not many people remember that, but effectively, we had our great 20th century dictator the same way that Germany and Russia did. You see this in Orwell, right? The idea of these three national superpowers. They're kind of the same. And obviously, I'd much rather live in FDR's America than Stalin's Russia, but fundamentally, we did a lot of the same things. We had effectively a controlled economy. If you want to look into this, you can look up the NRA, not the rifle one, an earlier one, which was an attempt by FDR to set price controls for everything. Now, that got struck down. It was one of the few things he lost on, but that indicates the direction he was going. So the reason I bring this up is to say that the conservative movement in America does not have a particularly old tradition. It doesn't go back to the founding of America, and claims that it does are kind of a cope. Uh, so, as we've said, right, there are a number of republics, and we are still in FDR's America, right? This is the way that our country justifies itself. You may have noticed that every time we pick a dictator to pick a fight with, uh, he is likened to a certain Austrian painter. That is the myth that justifies the American empire. We saved the world from Mustache Man, and so we get to control everything. So the conservative movement really has its, I guess you could say, second kind of rejuvenation of life in opposition to the Civil Rights Act, right? That is another kind of step forward in, the growing evil of the American empire. And in response to that, you get figures like uh, Richard Nixon, who was extraordinarily popular. We're still being rocked by anti-ICE riots even now. It's not quite as much in the news, but they're still going on. And many people have brought up Kent State when U.S. National Guard, I believe, ended up shooting 8 protesters. And while that moment was sort of immortalized in the protest movement, you can read songs about it from Buffalo Springfield and others. But what's not often discussed is that propelled Nixon to two of the greatest electoral victories in history. The conservative movement, what we see now in the Tea Party and then the MAGA base, is very much Nixon's coalition, what we called the silent majority, the people who were opposed to what was kind of the woke of their day. And so after Nixon, that base, which sort of became the Republican Party, and you can even hear leftists talk about this with the great party switch, when areas like the American South swapped from effectively, Democrat control for
They can never
generations to
put a year on it,
Republican.
though. They can never put a year on this switch, yeah. Or show anyone who actually crossed the floor or anything like that.
Right, exactly. But point is, that group became the Reagan coalition. And with that, the kind of driving thread of that party, that political tendency, became the Cold Warriors. And that continued up until the wall fell. And through this entire time, you've got to remember, America has been effectively at war since World War II. The whole government, the whole society is set up to fight the Cold War. That's why we exist. And so when the wall falls, we have a dual loss of purpose. Both what is the point of this country? What is the point of this economy? Which again is a war economy. And also, well, what is the purpose of the Republican Party and the conservative movement? And you have a split then. And the reason we have the neocons and their opposition, the paleocons, is those are two different reactions to the wall falling. The neocons say, awesome, we did it. We defeated the Reds. Now we get to rule the world. We need a new enemy to fight. And that enemy first became the militia movement, domestic, right? It became figures like Tim McVeigh, it became Waco, it became that, and then very quickly morphed into the scourge of radical Islam, quote unquote. And the paleocons said, no, 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 we did it. You told us this is why we were doing all of these things that in another time would be considered, you know, unwise or unsensible. It's because we were fighting a war. Now we are a normal country again. We don't need to control the world because communism is dead. It was a good faith reaction. And unfortunately, those people were politically defeated. I would argue until now, there's a great interaction with Paul Gottfried. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he obviously was one of the original paleocons back in the early 90s. And when asked about him versus his opposition, he said, well, there's one thing that I feel quite good about. My friends are getting younger, my enemies are getting older, right? So the neocons won, but now look at them, right? You've seen an immense brain drain. I mean, look at the difference between Irving Kristol and Bill Kristol. Irving Kristol, regardless of your opinions, was a competent guy. He was very smart. Bill Kristol is stupid, like a very stupid man. So that tendency has died as a votive force, right? It's not alive, it's not living anymore, but they still have an immense amount of power. And so the reason that I'm going through all of this is to say America as an empire exists to fight a war. And obviously, as this regards the economy, we still kind of have a command economy. We've sold off an immense amount of our industrial base, and that happened during the 70s and 80s under these kind of neoliberal or neoconservative economics. But uh, what we do have as far as manufacturing is entirely high-end defense manufacturing. So an example I think of, there's a town not too far away from me called Radford, Virginia. Other than having a very unimpressive university, what do they have there? They have a missile plant, and that is the only good paying local job that isn't connected to the university. So one of the devilish things about this is, like I said, when people talk about military Keynesianism, we do effectively still live under an economic system where the
Yeah.
government decides to spend money on things, and that effectively creates a jobs program. And so that's the really thorny issue, right? Well, why do we always pick wars? Well, one of it is because we have bloodthirsty psychopaths at the wheel. That's definitely part of it. Another part of it, and this is why there's such a deep divide in the Republican Party, is in a lot of red states, in a lot of rural areas, what good jobs there are defense contractors. And this goes down to obviously the high-end stuff like planes and missiles, but even small things like, who makes the boxes for trucks and who does all of these things.
So,
They're
so a slight
required.
diversion here, but it is relevant. You say you've got the high end stuff, and I agree you have. But a lot of the basic components going into these things are now manufactured in China.
That's true. But remember, right, I think it's called the Berry Amendment, but there's a requirement at how made in America any piece of gear, any piece of kit the US Army uses. And obviously, you're 100% right. And this is a very real problem. And even under Biden, you saw a desire through the CHIPS Act to return that sort of specialized manufacturing to the US. I think that that pivot is real. But on the other end, it goes down to, I mean, things you would never even think of, like nylon web gear, stuff like that. There are a million different mom and pop shops with, 5 to 100 employees that make some specialized piece of kit in some town you've never heard of. And that is the cornerstone of the economy. And to go back to my point that the US exists to fight a war, a very valid question is why do we keep making tanks? We make tanks all the time. And what do tanks exist to do? Well, effectively, the M1 Abrams is designed to fight in Germany against the Russians. It's not designed for what we've been doing since the Cold War, which is kicking over mud huts and blowing away goat farmers. Which, I mean, look, I don't have sympathy for many of those goat farmers personally, but you can look at something like the M1 Abrams and say, well, that's not what you do.
Yeah, it's
But
not the right tool for the job.
we do that because one, we sort of just never stopped preparing for the Cold War. And two, that's a huge economic engine. Those things are incredibly expensive. It takes a lot of effort to make them.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.